This is the story of Berend Borst, a Dutch veteran. This is his experience of the German invasion. This is the 5th episode. The war between the Netherlands and Nazi Germany is over, but Borst's ordeal is not. Let's begin. Wednesday, May 15th. The gruesome and unforgettable days were over, but now we had to wait to see how long we would still be prisoners of war. The next morning, the prisoners of war had to get up early again. A wounded man had to be fetched, and various chores were assigned to us. Red Cross cars also came, which picked up the remaining wounded. I had to help fetch the wounded from the basement, but there was such a horrible stench there that I immediately left the basement. I cannot imagine that people could have lain there for days in such a spoiled atmosphere. For the prisoner of war hospital soldiers who had to help in the cellar, it was not a pleasant task either. Then I would rather be on the barn floor, although it was far from fresh there. Gradually, all the wounded were transported except for a few lightly wounded who were ambulatory patients. The wounded man who still had to be fetched lay in a house not far from the hospital. It was still dusky, and the German soldiers in that house acted so mysteriously and nervously that it made you itch. That transport of the wounded went well because we no longer had to be afraid of the battle that might start again. That was how it had been the previous day, but now it was over and remained quiet. After fetching that wounded man, I went to see Farmer Van Leven, who was milking the cows with his farmhand Gert. These animals had also had a hard time. In the 5 days, they had only been milked once, and that happened at midnight. All the cows also walked around with taut udders. I also helped with milking 5 cows, another prisoner of war helped too. The milk was used by the remaining Germans. A number of cows and horses had been killed by bullets. Everywhere, the carcasses were buried by workers. The so-called bombs that were dropped by parachutes had to be fetched by us. They were very heavy, and most contained food, and others bandages and ammunition, including even hand grenades. These bombs were about 1.5 meters long. Furthermore, we cleaned up the yard around the farmhouse and swept it. The farmhouse had remained almost entirely undamaged except for a few bullet holes, for which the farmer was very grateful. Many farmhouses were severely damaged. While sweeping, I found a fired bullet whose tip was slightly damaged. I showed it to the other prisoners of war, one of whom walked with his arm in a sling because he had a graze shot in his shoulder. He asked me if he could have the bullet, to which I gave him the little treasure. Later, in the prisoner of war camp, I saw him boasting to others that he had had that bullet, which he proudly showed, in his arm. The day passed with various activities. The next day, Thursday, May 16th, we also made the time short with all sorts of little things. We could and were allowed to move further away from the farmhouse and went to watch the digging of large pits, which were made by workers. In them, the killed cows were buried. We saw that the Germans removed the machine gun around the farmhouse. The receiving and transmitting device was also removed from the shed. Just like the previous days, we washed ourselves nicely, which refreshed us wonderfully. For lacking blankets, we kept the uniform on, day and night, now for a week. In the long run, it became very unclean. We shaved ourselves with the razor of Gert, the farmhand of Van Leven. It was in the afternoon when a gentleman drove onto the farmyard in a luxury car. It was the mayor of Katwijk. He told us why and how the Netherlands had capitulated and that the Queen had had to leave against her will. Now we got a better view of the capitulation. Some time later, a truck drove up with several prisoners of war on it. Among them was one of my friends, namely Willard. I barely recognized the man from The Hague, he looked so different. On the truck, various things were loaded. The prisoners of war who were on the farm were told that everyone now had to go with the truck. So finally, we could join the other prisoners of war. We said goodbye warmly to Farmer Van Leven and the others, then got on the truck and left the farm. With Wielard, I discussed the events of the last few days. He told me that they had been in contact with our battery commander, Captain Van Hemert. They had reported that Huub Heestemans had been killed, and that I had been reported missing because I had not been with my friends since Sunday afternoon, and they did not know where I actually was. The other prisoners of war had stayed together in the garage those days. From Tuesday afternoon, we saw a large smoke cloud on the horizon to the south. That was burning Rotterdam. Even from such a great distance, Rotterdam-Valkenburg, the fire was still clearly visible. Among the civilians at Farmer Van Leven's, there was a boy I haven't mentioned yet but to whom I now want to dedicate a special section. I knew him only as January. He was a farm boy from Valkenburg, about 16 years old. What this boy did during the war is incredible. He often rode a bicycle from the farm to Valkenburg. To reach the village, he had to pass through the fiercest fire lines. To avoid being mistaken for a soldier, he wore a white cloth around his neck. In the village, he visited civilians who were gathered everywhere. He took various items from the shops back to the field hospital where we and the Germans could use them. Among other things, he also brought postcards. I received one from him, which I wrote on Wednesday to inform my family that I was well despite the circumstances. My family members at home would be anxiously waiting for news from me. Since no one could leave the farm, I gave the card to a boy who came to milk near the farm on Thursday morning. He would post the card for me in Katwijk. Sending that card gave me relief. Now they at home would know how I was. I myself would dearly like to know how things were in Zwolle. I had no idea what the situation was at home. In the village, Jan had spoken to Van Leven's wife, and now brought her greetings to the farmer. The farmer's wife and their children were unharmed. This reassured the farmer, as he had not heard from them since Friday. Because Jan repeatedly went back to the village, he was very popular with the Germans. They all called him by his first name. The civilians and prisoners of war were also always curious about Jan's return because he brought us the only news from Valkenburg. We noticed that he snooped around everywhere in the village because he always had something to tell. We learned that Valkenburg was suffering greatly from the shelling, which surprised none of us. He was able to name several Valkenburgers who had been killed or wounded. The mother of one of the dead, a civilian in the hospital, had also been killed in the shelling. Later, Jan came with the news that de Roode's sister had also become a victim. On Tuesday afternoon, after the capitulation, de Roode immediately went to the village and attended the funeral. We often warned him and pointed out that those trips to Valkenburg were life-threatening, but he paid little heed. He did not see the danger. It was always a wonder to us when he came back unharmed. Jan himself believed he was bulletproof. On Tuesday morning, he showed up with a tricycle. He had stuffed it with all sorts of things. You couldn't think of anything he didn't have on that tricycle. He himself found it wonderful that he could bring so much back to the farm, so he went straight back to the village. He did this twice in a row. The last time he came back, he showed us the tricycle's bin. It had holes in it. They were bullet holes that had been shot into it along the way. We again emphatically told him that it was so dangerous to expose himself unprotected. He found it risky too, so he did not go back right away. We unloaded the contents from the tricycle and brought them inside. Most of it went to the kitchen or the doctor, and some was distributed among the wounded, and we made sure we got our share. One of the German soldiers, who was not very badly wounded, thought that Jan should wear a Red Cross band. Jan thought that was a great idea, but how was he to get such a band? The Germans knew what to do. We had Jan fetch a piece of red and white linen. The farmwife's sewing machine also had to be brought down from the attic. Once the German had everything, he sewed a white band with a red cross on it. It was quickly ready, and Jan immediately put on his new band. He came to us cheerfully and said, "Now nothing more can happen to me, now I am safe with this band on my arm." Then he went to take the sewing machine back upstairs. He walked down the hallway to go up the stairs at the front door of the farmhouse. But he had only climbed a few steps when he rolled down noisily with the sewing machine and all. "I've been hit, I'm wounded," he screamed. Alarmed, we rushed to help. He lay deathly pale at the bottom of the stairs, groaning loudly. We lifted him up and carried him to a side room. The doctor stripped him of his upper clothes. Between his neck and shoulder was a hole, and a similar hole could be seen at the back of his neck. A bullet had struck him straight through the neck. That was very strong indeed. Many times he had cycled through the fire lines while bullets flew into the tricycle without him suffering the slightest injury. And here indoors, with his new Red Cross band, which was supposed to protect him as he had just said, he was hit by a stray bullet. It was a curious coincidence. There lay January, his eyelids trembled, and he repeatedly complained, "I'm in so much pain. I'm in so much pain." We tried to encourage him, but it helped little. We let him sip some water between his lips from time to time. We felt very sorry for him. On either side of him lay two Germans, who also felt sorry for the boy, although they themselves were also wounded. We gave them some water too. Another German, lying in another corner, also kept asking for water, but when he got some, he immediately spit it out. He could not swallow, was deathly pale, and his eyes were dull. He was in very bad shape. He soon breathed his last. We covered the dead man with a blanket. We often came to Jan, but we could do little for him, it looked hopeless. The doctor also often came to look but was pessimistic. The wounded Germans in the barn regularly asked how Jan was doing. After the capitulation, Jan's father, who had been notified, came to see his son. In the evening, Jan was immediately transported with the severely wounded to Leiden. Later, I heard that Jan had died from the consequences. We traveled by car from the farmhouse hospital fortress to the garage where the other prisoners of war had been confined since Sunday afternoon, but they were no longer there. I had to stay in the garage to help sort out equipment and so on. We had to separate and sort Dutch and German goods. There was everything: cartridge drums, full or empty, belts, helmets, canteens, machine guns, carbines and rifles, various pieces of uniforms, blankets, etc. After we finished in the garage, we were taken to the prisoner of war camp housed in the nursery and saltery of Zwannenberg and Company. When I arrived there, I met my friends again. They were surprised to see me standing there. They had feared the worst during my absence and had not expected me to have remained unharmed. We were happy to see each other safe and sound. Now we were all reunited, except for Huub Heestemans. I had to report to the Dutch officers, also prisoners of war, and was added to the list of prisoners of war, and I could get a nice cup of coffee. Afterwards, I rejoined my friends and told them where I had been after leaving the garage on Sunday afternoon to go with that wounded German. From them, I learned that they had been in this camp since yesterday. From Sunday to Wednesday afternoon, they had been in the garage, where they had had a very hard time. There was no sleeping arrangement on the concrete floor, and they barely received any food. About 300 young men had to make do with a few canning jars and a couple of chickens that they had taken from a chicken coop next to the garage, slaughtered, and prepared. They had suffered from severe hunger. Then I had been better off with the cook at the farm. The garage had not been safe at all because bullets and shells constantly flew around the garage. Even a shell had gone through the wall at the back to stop right inside the building at the big front door. The projectile did not explode, which was fortunate, otherwise, it would have been terrible. They had experienced tense moments. My friends also told me that they had informed Cor Heistemans that his brother Hube had been killed on Friday morning at the airport. After the capitulation, Cor helped to fetch the wounded, and in doing so, he came everywhere and found his brother. He buried Hube next to the church, where the other casualties also found their resting place. Later, I spoke briefly with Cor. He was very impressed by the sad events. He showed me a ring of Hube's that he always wore. All prisoners of war were divided into groups, each group under a non-commissioned officer. I was in Group 12. Roll call was held at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. This roll call was taken by one of our camp officers and reported to the German. It is natural that we were guarded by the Germans, but the nursery was large, so we had enough freedom of movement. Usually, we lay outside in the lovely spring sunshine or in one of the greenhouses where it was comfortably warm. The food came from the military kitchen in Eegstgist. We could again enjoy the good food we were used to in the barracks. Cutting the bread was difficult because none of us had a knife, so we had to break it into pieces. But we managed to eat it, and that was the main thing. Not much happened in the camp, only we were terribly bored. We hoped that we would soon be released. Every hour we had to spend in captivity was one too many. Dutch military personnel often visited us. Colonel Trapman from Leiden came to visit us, and 3 sergeants from my battery showed their interest in us. It felt good to see and talk to acquaintances again. Most of the prisoners of war were infantrymen and lived in South Holland. Therefore, many civilians came to look for their family members who had been mobilized around Valkenburg. If a civilian came to the camp entrance and asked for someone, the entire camp was searched for the requested person. It was pleasant for the person involved, when the respective soldier was present. One can understand that the reunion was full of emotion and joy. But there were also many who did not find their lost ones in this camp. For them, this was a grim and unfavorable omen. They hoped that the sought person would be somewhere else, but where and how? I preferred not to stay too much at the entrance of the camp where other people regularly came to look for their family members. Again and again, there were those joyful meetings, people sitting together who had found each other, and their talk about the weather was not for me to see and hear, because I still knew nothing about my mother. 3 postcards were distributed in the camp. I sent 3 or 4 home. If one didn't arrive, another would, I thought. On the cards, we could only mention that we were prisoners of war and in good health. We spent the nights in the nursery building. 2 rooms were set up downstairs and 2 upstairs. Boards and straw mats were laid on the floor for us to sleep on. We kept our clothes on for warmth, while 2 of us shared a blanket. We didn't get much warmth from it because the nights were cold. The available space was barely large enough for all of us. We lay close together. I slept in the attic by the window between my friends. One night, I woke up and realized I was sleeping peacefully with my head against someone else's sweaty feet. On Friday afternoon, May 17th, we had to line up. What was going to happen? Were we going to leave the camp? We hoped so, but we were told that we were going to the airport. We marched off and went straight through Valkenburg. Now, I could see well what had been destroyed in the village. Terrible. Several houses were in ruins, especially around the church. Nearly all the houses in the center of the village had become uninhabitable due to the many direct hits from the barrage of grenades that had plagued the village for 4 days. The church had burned down completely. Only the tower and the walls were still standing. I shuddered when I saw the church and thought of the first days of the war. It had been a week since I entered the church. It seemed to me as if it had been years ago. In that 1 week, so much terrible had happened that it almost seemed impossible. This most tumultuous week of my life, which is also the most horrific, I will never forget. In front of the church were many fallen buried. On one side of the path lay the Dutch military personnel, and on the other side, the Germans. Elsewhere in the village, the fallen were buried. The 22 dead civilians found their final resting place in the cemetery next to the church. These war graves testified to the horror of war. We marched by silently and respectfully. At the airport, we had to pick up those parachute bombs. Many had landed there. The collection was done with trucks. No more than 5 of those bombs could be loaded because they were still full and very heavy. The trucks struggled to get over the soft field with their load. The parachutes were tremendously large, and some were made of silk. I could now look at the airplanes up close. The colossal aircraft all bore marks of wartime damage. Long rows of bullet holes from machine guns were visible. At the nose of each aircraft was a painted emblem, depicting England, embraced by a black hand. Those emblems were surely meant to symbolize that England would succumb to the German grasp. At least half of the airplanes had been shot and burned by artillery fire, which on the first day of the war had given such a fantastic sight. The burned-out planes now lay completely in ashes, except for the tips of the wings and the tail. A Dutch hospital soldier told me in the farm hospital that he had to retrieve a wounded German from such a burning aircraft while other Germans stood behind him with revolvers. The infantrymen who had been mobilized in the hangars searched for their belongings, but most had been destroyed or had vanished without a trace. Suitcases were found with cut-out bottoms. We left the airport again, after which we enjoyed a tasty meal in the camp. Saturday morning, May 18th. The previous days had passed slowly for most of us, and now there was another long day ahead of us. We had assembled for the morning roll call. It was taken as usual, but now we were also informed that someone from the medical service would come to the camp every morning because this was necessary for hygiene. That was a good arrangement, but it did not give us much hope that we would soon be free again. After the roll call, we devoured our bread and went to wash and freshen up. Unexpectedly, the news came that we were to be released and that everyone would return to their units. We didn't believe it at first, but it soon turned out to be true. The mood suddenly changed, everyone was cheerful, and we hurried to be lined up as quickly as possible. But before we could leave the camp, we had to sign our names on a list. It was not officially announced why this was necessary. It was said that it was a declaration that we would not take up arms against the German army in this war. Since it was not officially announced, we had no objection to signing. After that was done, we left the camp for freedom. We walked through the heavily damaged Valkenburg, and were escorted by Germans. At Katwijk aan de Rijn, they did not continue with us, and we could go on freely. The Dutch officers walked behind the procession. We were a hopeless collection of soldiers, each of us was missing something from his uniform. From Valkenburg, we had to walk to Noordwijk. In Noordwijk, I saw Major Mallinckrodt. He had contributed a lot to getting us freed from the prisoner of war camp. The major was the commander of most of the infantrymen who were captured. According to them, he had been very active during the war days. The major lives at Agnetenburg in Zwolle, maybe he knew some news from Zwolle. Therefore, I would have liked to speak to him, but the distance between a major and a recruit kept me back. From Noordwijk, everyone could return to their unit. Our group, led by Corporal Kortman, took the tram to Leiden. Finally, we arrived in the key city. 17 of us had left the city 9 days ago, now we returned with 16 men. Hoop Heestemans had to be left behind in Valkenburg. From the tram station, we marched directly to the Witterpoort barracks. We entered the courtyard while Corporal Kortman went to report us at the office. We were warmly received in the courtyard. We were bombarded with countless questions, to which we could not immediately respond. Everyone wanted to know this or that. People were very surprised to see me alive and well, since it had been announced to the battery that Hoob Heastemans had been killed and that I was missing, as they did not know I had been in the farmhouse hospital for 4 days. After sharing some details, I was able to break away from them and go to my room. For days, I had longed to lie down refreshed and free on my straw sack, a luxury we had sorely missed over the past week and therefore came to appreciate all the more. But the illusion came to nothing. When I got to my cot, I made the unpleasant discovery that my sleeping bag was gone. Moreover, my wallet was in the chest with the money gone. In the confusion of the first morning of the war, I had forgotten to lock the chest. More money was hidden at the bottom of the chest, but that had not been seen. It was not a pleasant feeling to discover that others could not keep away from my belongings. My bunkmate told me that various soldiers had slept in our rooms during the war. I later got the stolen money reimbursed from the canteen cash register. The first thing I did was to put on clean underwear and my best uniform. Now I felt much better. Once we, the former prisoners of war, were all ready, we went to the captain to ask if we could go to the bathhouse. That wasn't possible right away. So, we went to Major Weller. We told him that we had just been released from captivity and that we would like to go to the bathhouse. We could go immediately. Corporal Cortman received a written permit. A truck that was just at the barracks was made available to us, so we quickly got to the bathhouse. It was very busy with military personnel, but we were given priority because of the major's note. I have never taken such a wonderful bath. That completely revived us. We returned by truck. Now, my plan was to visit my family, the Van der Stoels. I asked the captain for permission, but I was told that no one was allowed to leave the barracks because the battery had to move today, Saturday, to make room for German occupation. Troops. The entire depot of the 5th Artillery Regiment was being moved to Hazerswood, a village about 12 kilometers from Leiden. Now that I was leaving Leiden, I needed to visit the Van der Stoel family. I asked the captain for nothing more, but left the office and went directly to Genestedstra. No matter what, I had to go there. The greeting at my family's home was most cordial. They had thought of me often and had been to the barracks several times to ask how I was doing and where I had been during the war days. They had always been told that I was missing, and at one point, I had even been reported as killed. No wonder they were very worried about me and were relieved to see me healthy and well. They were glad that I had come. I was even fed and pampered a bit. I didn't dare stay long, so I soon said goodbye. This concludes the final part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of these first days of the war for the Netherlands? Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.